My name is John Chalcraft. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Government at LSE, and I'm here to talk about my forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press, which is called Popular Politics in the Making of the Modern Middle East. So this is a wide-ranging history of popular protest in the Middle East of North Africa from the 18th century to the present. And it covers material from Morocco to Iran to the Ottoman Empire, through to Egypt and even Sudan and Algeria and the Arab East, the Mashriq, and also the Arabian Peninsula. And so it brings together a large quantity of already existing secondary literature on protest and popular movements in the region. But the main contribution is that I wanted to explore especially this theme of unauthorized and unruly collective action. These moments when people who are not designated as official actors in the political field, the moments when they band together, create new kinds of solidarity on the basis of this or that idea and challenge some aspect of the status quo. And it's this kind of new forms of collective agency that are relatively fragile, that, as I mentioned, are not authorized necessarily within the particular structure of the political field, and to try to retrieve that history and how they've really mattered. Partly there's been a tendency in Middle East studies and beyond. I mean, very good work has often focused on state power or on institutions, or it's focused on, the logics of socioeconomic change or development. And I've been very concerned to tease out what has been the role, impact, and importance against sort of histories of great men, against histories of modernizing elites or colonial officials drawing lines in the sand. When we look at the region through this question of popular politics, moments when ordinary people, ordinarily excluded from participation in the polity, ordinarily disenfranchised, and often socioeconomically disadvantaged, often of low status, when these people band together in ways that are capable of challenging the status quo. So it's that kind of, the idea is to say, the logics of this kind of action, they're not all, pre-existing institutions or pre-existing strategic or material interests. You get new kinds of fragile political subjects that then can develop and become organized and make an impact. So it's this idea, part of one of the things that scholars have struggled with, this idea of the vast condescension of posterity. We tend to think that when something comes into being, that somehow there must have been some official agency or some institution that underpinned it. Well, I want to say, no, sometimes there are projects, possibilities, forms of collective action that end up having an enormous impact, whereas at the beginning they're very risky. At the beginning they don't have strongly established forms of solidarity or collective agency. So I especially wanted to look at and expose this kind of history of popular politics in the making of the region. On the one side, I wanted to write against a certain kind of socio-economic determinism. So it's this idea that it's social and economic change that ultimately lies behind and can explain the forms of protest we see. And you have this, in some of the best scholarship on the region and on protests in the region, it tends to think in terms of a kind of a materialist hierarchy. It thinks of how economic and social interests above all and social transformation will then shape protest. And ultimately my frustration with that was that protest becomes a kind of epiphenomena of other things, other big processes. And so writing against that, while standing on the shoulders of people who've done all sorts of research in that tradition, I wanted to look at movements and uprisings and revolutions and protests in terms of mobilizing projects. What all the active agencies that are involved in making protest movements. And so that includes things like intellectual labor. It includes leadership. It includes the translocal appropriation of models for collective action. It includes strategies and tactics. And so we get to try to answer a question about, to what extent did activists hold their own fate and fortunes in their own hands? What was the role of moral, political, and intellectual leadership? And how were mobilizing projects put together? And so that's one of my contributions, I hope. And it's to write against a kind of a socioeconomic determinism in the study of protest. And it also is an attempt to write against a certain kind of post-colonial scholarship, which has, when it comes to thinking of resistance, has either tended to erase the subaltern, those who are disenfranchised and disadvantaged, and it tends to say, well, they can't speak. We can't even begin to study their resistance because they simply, when they speak, their language reflects the discourse of dominant elites, or discourse is construed as this overwhelming mechanism of social control. And I wanted to write against that version of reality that we see in Middle East studies. It's quite important, and it's occupied quite a lot of very fine minds, but we can't accept, or I can't accept, that these mobilizing projects with their identities, their normative commitments, the things that really matter to people, their strategies, their goals, that we should see them through a lens of a kind of discursive determinism. So I wanted to write against socioeconomic determinism and discursive determinism and bring out the active agencies that are involved in the making of protest. That's on the one side. But the other main contribution is I wanted to think in terms not of one of these big meta-narratives of historical transformation, such as globalization or capitalist development or modernization. Instead, the way the book is written is in terms of the rise, the establishment, the reform, and then the crises in different kinds of political hegemony, how authorities establish and win consent for what they do, and how these mobilizing projects and active agencies, first of all, how they're rooted in and enabled by moments when authorities can no longer win consent for what they do, and how their agency then has an impact in shaping that authority or its reform or its crisis or its rise or its establishment. So those are the two main sorts of contributions that I wanted to make to Middle East studies and debates about protest and theory. So the book, it runs from the late 18th century to the present, and it's a mix of chronology and theme, but it's done in terms of the rise and fall of political hegemony. And so you have the 19th century, which is these three major states, the Alawi dynasty in Morocco, the Ottoman Empire, and then Iran, and these and then the sorts of crises these states encountered in terms of the encounter with colonialism and so on. And so this is the first part of the book, and it deals with movements and especially religious revivalism and heterodox religious movements, which I thought were underplayed in the literature, where there was a lot of emphasis. There's a lot of emphasis in the literature on different kinds of modernizing reform movements, like the Arabi movement of 1881 to 2 or the Young Turks. But I found in doing the work for this book that heterodox religious revivalism, whether in Algeria or in Morocco or Sudan, played an important role in the movements of the 19th century. So, and then when we come to the interwar period, I have part 2 of the book is the more direct colonial rule of the interwar period, the rugged armed struggles that broke out at the end of the First World War, and then the new ways in which activists, nationalists, Islamists, women's movements it started to create new vehicles for mobilization and new ways to connect to subaltern populations and forms of mass mobilization. And that brings us in the book to the third part, which has to do with the immediate post-independence period in the 1950s and 60s. So new kinds of powers seize control of the state, you have national independence, and then you have, I studied some of the armed struggles, the Palestinians, the armed struggle in South Yemen, in Algeria, 1954 to 62, and some of the social revolutionary movements of that period. And then the book moves to part 4, which is more about Islamism, it's about neoliberalism, and it's about the rise of new kinds of also liberal and democratically oriented movements in that period, and the uprisings of 2011 and people power movements, whereby post-independent states started to lose their ability to win the consent of the population, and you start to have uprisings and protests against those states themselves. And so there's a wide so overall, it's a very wide cross section of different kinds of activism. You have Islamist movements, labor movements, women's movements. You have armed struggle. You have non-armed struggle. You have different kinds of institutional disruption and other more reformist styles of protest. So yeah, a wide array of different sorts of case studies and mixed together by chronology and theme. When a wider audience is looking at protest in the Middle East and North Africa, what you find in the press, what you find in the media, and especially in the context of the war on terror that dominated US foreign policy in the 2000s, is it's difficult to see beyond chaos. It's difficult to see beyond violence. This sense that protest can never come to any good. It's easy to fall into a view that protesters are recalcitrant or irrational. We don't have access to, the mainstream press doesn't regularly engage necessarily with the quality research that some academics have done. I believe for a wider audience, this book will give, it's not a rosy story of progress and modernization and globalization, but it does take mobilizing projects seriously. It suggests that they hold out the hope for positive transformation, and I think readers who have a general interest in the region or in protest more generally will be able to see through, by reading this book, they'll be able to see through some of those media stereotypes. They'll be able to see some of the ways in which protest has been meaningful, the ways in which it's addressed real social, economic, political and cultural problems, that the Middle East isn't a sort of incomprehensible cauldron that nobody can understand, full of recalcitrant people who are fanatical, etc. Instead, while not wanting to exaggerate or romanticize, the book, I believe, can give us a serious research-based view, which I hope is written in a reasonably, readable way, for wider readers to come to some, more believable and thorough understanding of actually what are quite complex issues.